Hello. Thank you for coming to our session. We're going to talk about handling HTML markup with Drupal's Migrate API. I'm Benji Fisher.
And I'm Marco Villegas.
And it's November 23rd. So thank you for coming to our session. Did we decide who was supposed to start? Do we still have that blank slide in there?
That wasn't planned?
Looks intentional.
Yeah, that looks intentional.
Resume presentation. What? Okay. Well, I guess we know who's going to handle this slide. I'm Benji Fisher. I recently started working at Hook42. On Drupal.org, I'm Benji Fisher. I didn't sign up for Twitter in time, so I couldn't get at Benji Fisher, so I put in my favorite number in between, at Benji17Fisher. And I'm one of those on most other platforms too.
Yep, I'm Marco Villegas, as you know, and I work for Isovera, so thanks to them to bring me here. And you can find me in Drupal.org on Twitter if you want as Marco07.
And when he says thank you to Isovera for bringing him here, Marco lives in Peru, and he came all this way. It's the first time he's met the team at Isovera. I first met Marco in person 2 days ago. 3 days ago?
Yeah.
If you want to follow along, the slides are already up on my GitLab pages, benjifisher.gitlab.io/slide decks/index.html. And that is a beautifully styled, unordered list of several of my presentations. I think this one's at the top.
Yep, so we will talk a bit about the Drupal 8 Migrate API. And what is that doing? It is moving, it lets us move the content from, for instance, Drupal 6 sites to Drupal 8 sites, or Drupal 7 sites to Drupal 8 sites. But not only Drupal to Drupal, you can also migrate sites from other systems, or you can even do imports that are continuous, for instance, based on feeds. And it is a robust, flexible tool that has been around for a while. So it is in Drupal 8, but before it was a contributable in 7 and also in 6.
And I have a feeling that we seem to have skipped some slides here.
Yeah.
Let's try to back up. Where are we? There were supposed to be a few more slides in the introduction that we seem to have missed somehow.
No, it's
Oh, no, we're good. I'm sorry.
okay.
So the Migrate API, like Drupal, is best at handling structured data. So you have a Drupal node, it'll have some file attachments, and those are sort of a separate field for each of your files. You can have related taxonomy terms. You can have references to authors, and you can have references to other nodes. So this is the sort of thing we mean by structured data in Drupal, and these are the sorts of things that the Migrate API is designed to handle well. I again hit the wrong button. Okay.
Yeah. So, but unstructured text, for instance, HTML inside the body fields of many places that we use inside Drupal is not really structured. So we can do several things to actually handle what is inside there during a migration. For instance, regular expressions, but we can also use HTML parsing. So our approach was to actually create some process plugins inside Migrate Plus while we were working on a project for Pega Systems at Isovera. And we have created some set of plugins that we will present here and are already in Migrate Plus. So you can use them.
And of course, we should really thank Isovera and Pega for supporting contributing these back to the Drupal community. So an outline of the talk. This is, I think, the last slide on the introduction, so that's where we are. Then we're going to talk about parsing HTML with regular expressions. And then we'll talk about parsing HTML using the PHP DOM document class. That's using proper parsing. We'll talk then about the Drupal 8 Migrate API, both an overview of what it does and how our parsing plugins fit into it. We'll talk about a few further things, further work that could be done, that we hope will be done in this direction, and a little bit of a wrap-up at the end. So parsing HTML with regular expressions. So very briefly, the idea is you have some HTML string, and you use some regular expressions to pull out the pieces that you need to change or find.
Yeah, so a simple example that something we would like to do, for instance, is extract the URL from this anchored HTML element. And it's probably about getting the href value of that element. So how would you do that?
So I know how to do that. All you have to do is come up with the right regular expression. So the part in parentheses is the part that's going to represent the URL, and that's just any character that's not a closing quote, at least one. And then we start the regular expression with a literal less than sign and an A for the anchor tag, a space, href equals quote. Then we have the part we want to capture, a closing quote, close the HTML tag. Markup is whatever string you have here. Anchor href equals HTTPS. Have to scroll a little bit to see it. Then you use the preg match function with the regular expression, the markup, and $matches, which is an uninitialized variable. That gives you the match. Matches comes out to be an array, and the number one element of that array is the part you've matched, which is the URL. I love regular expressions. They're easy to use. They're well supported in PHP.
That's definitely a way. So remember, HTML is not that simple. So for instance, what would you do if the anchor tag is in uppercase?
True, HTML doesn't care. So I can just add a flag to the regular expression to say, make it case insensitive, no problem.
Also, if inside the anchor element you have not only the href attribute, you can also have the class, you can have other ID, for instance, attributes that you can have there, so maybe you need to change that.
Okay, so instead of just a space, I'll put in a little pattern that'll match anything other than the closing angle bracket tag up to the href.
Yeah, also single quotes can be used in HTML. It's allowed, right?
Okay, so I want the opening quote and the closing quote to be the same, and each one can either be a single quote or a double quote. So I'll put in a little character class, I'll capture that, and then I'll use a back reference to make sure they match.
Okay, that totally works, but how about if you have new lines inside the element?
Okay, so instead of just a space, I'll use \s, which will match any space character, space, tab, new line. Yeah.
Okay, that totally works. And how about if you have inside the URL some character that is, for instance, a single double quote escaped inside there. So you need.
Is that allowed in an href? No, I should look up the RFC to see exactly what's allowed in a URL string.
And that's why we want to do something else, and that's the wrong question to be asking.
You think I'm trying to reinvent the wheel here? I'm solving a problem that's already been solved.
Exactly. So we have. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this slide is mine. So everything that I just said in that little conversation is captured in this. And you see the regular expression is getting a little complicated. I think this will work pretty well, but the point is that this is the right answer to the wrong question. This is an already solved problem. We should not be using regular expressions to parse HTML because we're just working too hard.
Yep. So here's an innocent question in Stack Overflow. So how about someone wants to match this HTML, so a paragraph and an anchor with an href, but you want to skip the break lines and also the horizontal rules with a specific class. So how do we do that?
So this question was asked on Stack Overflow, and it got a rather well-known answer. and it's kind of fun to read. I suggest you follow the link if you haven't seen it before and read the whole thing in full. It starts off pretty straightforward, a little pedantically. It says, you can't parse HTML or XHTML with regex because HTML can't be parsed by regex. Regex is not a tool that can be used to correctly parse HTML. And then it sort of goes off the rails. Every time you attempt to parse HTML with regular expressions, the unholy child weeps the blood of virgins, and Russian hackers pwn your web app. Parsing HTML with regex summons tainted souls into the realm of the living. And it goes on, which you should read the whole thing at some point. And then there's a horizontal rule, and it says, have you tried using an XML parser instead? In other words, use the solution that someone else has come up with.
Yep, so one alternative to do that is actually using the document object model to do that parsing. So if you see it at a glance, you will have, again, this HTML, but instead of using regex to do that, you will use this document object model that originally was done for JavaScript in the browsers, but there is a PHP extension that is in your every PHP installation that you have, probably in most of the distributions it is, and you will have that available to do traversing of the DOM in an easier way.
So here are some basics of using the DOM document class. It uses GNOME's libxml library in the background, but you don't have to worry about that because PHP provides a wrapper for it. And you can access your element using XPath expressions. So if you're just using straight PHP, you start out by creating a new DOM document object. Then if you're dealing with HTML, which is what we're talking about, and $markup is the variable containing your HTML string, you call the load HTML method with that variable. And then you create a new DOM XPath object. And you can use that to query the object. So //a is a pretty simple XPath expression. It will select all of the anchor elements, all the links in your documents. So use the query method on the XPath object, and you can do a for each loop over it. Then for each node, and we call it HTML node in the snippet because node means something different in Drupal. You call the get attribute method, and that will reliably give you the href attribute of your anchor element. And then in the snippet, we just echo that, but you could replace it. You could do whatever sort of munging you have to on it.
Yep, so some more examples to try to provide some examples on how this can be more expressive for traversing the HTML inside that you want to process is, for instance, this is the first that we have seen, but for instance, if you want to match only the anchor characters that has a specific class value, you can do that using the second line. Just using brackets is a way to set give me this attribute, elements with this attribute set. But you can even go farther and say, I just want the anchor tags that are under a list element. And that really is a usual thing that you want to do when traversing the DOM. So you only want to change, for instance, the links that are inside a subset of the HTML soup that you are receiving. And you can combine all those. So you can, for instance, in this case, say, I want only the anchors that are inside a list element and have this specific class. So as you can see, is maybe a more expressive for doing the traversing of the HTML.
So these are requirements that are more complicated than the simple question we started with of just extracting the href attribute from an anchor element. I could probably come up with regular expressions that would do this sort of thing. Would it be as reliable? You're supposed to answer.
No, definitely no.
Would it be harder?
Yeah, definitely.
So at the end of processing your DOM document object, then you just call the save HTML method, and you get an HTML string back again. So this is not new. How many people already know that you shouldn't use regular expressions for parsing HTML? We've got 3, 6, 8, 10 or 12 people. Come on, raise your hands. Okay. At least half the people in the room already know you're not supposed to do that. How many people still use regular expressions for parsing HTML? A couple of people are willing to admit it. So why?
Familiarity, maybe?
Familiarity is one reason, yeah.
Kind of already in the toolbox.
It's already in the toolbox. I would say convenience, which is sort of the same thing as saying that it's already in the toolbox. So you have to go to the PHP manual and look up how to do those basics, the DOM document object and the XPath. If we could make it convenient for you to use DOM processing, would you do it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, is the response from the audience. Great.
Yeah, so let's try to talk now a bit about Drupal 8 Migrate API. So first, a bit of an introduction. The Drupal 8 Migrate API is based in this ETL paradigm. So there is 3 different phases. In the first, you have this extract phase, where you act inside Drupal 8 Migrate API is the source plugins. So you get the information you need from for instance, the Drupal 6 instance. You get the actual data from the title of the node. And then you have a second phase that is transform. And in this phase, you actually change everything that you need to do inside this title or this body to change the links, for instance, as we have been seeing. And in the final phase, that is the load, you actually save that into a Drupal 8 node, for instance. And you will, those are the 3 specific phases of this paradigm. And inside this Drupal 8 implementation of this paradigm, in the second phase, that is transform, is the right place to actually process the data and use this DOM model to actually retrieve and handle all the HTML that we are doing.
So I also find that the process step, or the T part, the transform step, is the most interesting, because any migration is going to have a single source, it'll have a single destination. Those are the Drupal terms. So the extract and the load is only one per migration. But in between those, every field can have some processing done on it. And some fields will have several different processing steps. So it seems to me that's where the action is, that's where the fun part is, and that's where I spend most of my attention. So at a glance, what we do to try to give you some tools to make it convenient to do the processing: you start with an HTML string, you hit it with the process plugins that we've written in the Migrate API, and then at the end you convert it back to an HTML string, and that's what you load. All of this is within the process section, though, or the T step of the ETL paradigm.
So, as we mentioned, we have written some new process plugins for managing this HTML, and this is the list that we will go in depth later, but the goal here is that to make you convenient, as Benji was mentioning before, to use the DOM document inside the processing of migration in Drupal.
So the first plugin is the DOM plugin, and it does 2 things. It will create a DOM document object from an HTML string, and it'll go in the other direction. So when writing a migration, how many people have actually written migrations? So it's all only a few people raise their hands, less than half the audience. So it's all configured in a YAML file, and there's for each of the 3 steps, extract, transform, or load, or source, process, and destination. There's a separate section in the YAML file. In the process section, for each field that you're processing, you can have 1 or more process plugins added. So typically, the HTML strings are in the body field. So if we're processing the body field, we start with the DOM plugin with method import. So that says go in the direction from a string to a DOM document object. Say what the source is. Then we'll do several of the other plugins, 1 or more, and at the end we'll use the DOM plugin again with the export method that goes in the other direction. That produces a string that gets loaded into the body field.
Good. So those 2 were the start and the end, and now we will present like some of the middle plugins that you will use. So for instance, this is the str replace plugin, the DOM str replace plugin. And it will allow you to change the pseudo. For instance, to change pseudo name during the migration, you will use this expat expression to say, I want to go over all the anchor tags, and I want to get the href attribute, and I would like to do a search and replace, but over that specific URL string. So underlying behind the scenes, what we are doing is checking that this is inside the href value and replacing it with this. So naturally, you can do more things inside here. And actually, this is using regular expression, but only for this replacement. Because it's a string, we want to change from one to another. But to actually get the right href values that we want to go over with, we are using the DOM model.
Yeah, and this is actually a pretty common use case in a migration. When you're building the new site, sometimes you're going to change your subdomains. So we suggest that the old subdomain is documentation.example.com, and the new one is help.example.com. That's sort of typical. Yeah, question.
Can you add like ands and ors to this particular, like for attribute options, can I have a name and like a specific class or something like that?
So yes, this is.
Let me repeat the question. So the question is, can you add conditions instead of just selecting all anchor elements, right?
Exactly. So what you would do is change the expat expression to allow for those cases. And if they are just too dissimilar, what you will do is add 2 of these instances. So one for all the anchor tags with a given class, and another with another class. You can actually do that with an expat expression, but it's a little bit yeah. So you can just add 2, and it's the easier way without knowing much about the expat thing.
Yeah, we gave some examples of things you can do with XPath expressions. On a recent project, I got into some really complicated XPath expressions. It's a whole other technology to learn. But XPath is a pretty expressive language, and we're keeping our examples simple, but you can certainly do more with it. Another plugin we wrote will search for an XPath expression, and then it will replace whatever it finds with whatever styles you've configured in your editor module. And this was used for an ongoing feed where content was being written in some other system, and we didn't have control over what markup they did, and we wanted to make it look as if it had been written on the site using the WYSIWYG editor, using the same styles that had been configured for the WYSIWYG editor. So this is the DOM apply styles plugin, and you just tell it which format you want to use, say the format for HTML, and then you can give it a list of rules. One of them might be that anything in the source that has a bold tag, a B tag, replace that with whatever we've configured in the styles. So it might be div class equals emphasized, or whatever markup you've decided you want to use in your WYSIWYG editor gets applied to the markup as it gets imported into the site.
Yeah, and I would like to add that this plugin is a really good example on how these plugins can integrate more with what actually Drupal does. So in this case, it's integrating, as Benji mentioned, with the styles that you already have in Drupal. So it's that tight integration that will give us more convenience that Benji was suggesting at the start.
And then the next one is the real kicker. This is what makes it all worthwhile.
So when you do migrations, sometimes you change the IDs. So not every time you are keeping the IDs, for instance, the Drupal 7 node ID into a Drupal 8 node ID, because of many reasons. So what you need to do is, if someone have added a URL /node/1 inside the actual body text of one of the fields, you actually need to change that if the IDs have changed, right? So what you can do is use this DOM migration plugin that is similar to the migration lookup plugin that we have in Migrate, but it uses DOM to actually get to the place, and then behind the scenes, actually, it's also using the migration lookup plugin code to actually do the lookup. So what you would do in this case in specific would be I want to get all the anchor tags, and I want to change them. So in the same way that we have used the other plugin, we will just add a search and a replace, but here is a more expressive regular expression that we want to first have a first group that will have the node ID that we want to change. So in this case, we identify that with /node/group, and then we want the digits there, that's a node ID that we want to replace. And then we provide the replace that we want for the full regex. And the replace is, we have this special token that is documented on the plugin naturally, that this is where the new ID will be. So this, as you can see, for instance, this can change a bit depending on your use case. But for instance, you can pass several migrations in the same way that you can do that with migration and lookup plugin. So this will search articles and page migrations lookup in order to find this ID that we are searching. So this is, I think, one of the main reasons we have started writing this with DOM plugins, because it was kind of hard to actually do in the other way.
So by the way, those of you who are familiar with regular expressions, what are those @ signs doing? The @ signs, I stumped them. The @ signs are the delimiters of the pattern. And typically you use a slash to show the start and the end of the pattern. Why don't I want to use a slash in this particular pattern?
Because it contains.
Yeah, so you have to escape them, kind of.
Right, I would have to escape the actual slashes, and I want to use the slash as a literal character, so the simplest way to do that is to use a different delimiter. So that's what the @ signs are doing there. You could also use vertical bars or pound signs or whatever.
Never learn all of regex.
So I am actually a Vim wizard, so I know my regular expressions, although they're different flavors. So this is not done. Like a website, it's never done. What do we want to do next? We want more process plugins. So we have the basic one that does the translation to and from strings, and then we've written 3 more, and they're in the Migrate Plus module. This is only a few months old, but already there's a contributed module, the Migrate Media Handler, which provides additional DOM-based process plugins. And this is specifically for the use case when your Drupal 7 site has file or image fields and you want to create D8 media entities. And it also handles various tokens embedded in your text fields. So people are already jumping on the bandwagon, and that's really exciting. There's a meta issue on the Migrate Plus module, DOM manipulation and process plugins, which has 4 issues for the plugins we've already written. Those are fixed and closed, but there are already a couple of more. Maybe we want to process non-attribute strings. So currently the DOM string replace plugin will pull out the href, or it'll pull out the source attribute of your image tags or the class attribute of anything. But maybe we want to actually do some processing on the text portion of a field. We can't do that yet. Maybe we need that. If someone has a use case for it and actually writes it, yay, we'll have another plugin. We can replace an HTML element with another one, but we can't yet just remove unwanted HTML elements. So that's another issue that's already attached to the meta. And your next project, when you have a need that we haven't anticipated yet, think about it. Don't hard code everything in a custom PHP process plugin. Make it configurable, make it reusable, and then maybe you can contribute it back to the Migrate Plus module, and other people can use it too.
Yep. So in the actual first issue that I opened about the DOM plugins, there was a comment from Mike Ryan, as you know, is one of the creators of the actual Migrate API and maintainer of that project for a long time. He tells this. So just for your information, my go-to for HTML parsing has been QueryPath, and it's especially good if you're dealing with old school HTML, and that is something that is not using the actual DOM extension of PHP. Is using another library that is called QueryPath to actually do that. And it would be great if we can extend Drupal. Yep. So it would be great to get these plugins more configurable to use other libraries. So, for instance, one approach is what the URL source plugin does for data parsers. So you can get XML or CSV files if you are using these plugins, because it has a separate plugin inside Migrate Plus that are called data parsers. And that is a way of extending that. And now that we have plugins, the plugin API inside core, it would be easy to do a similar thing inside Migrate Plus to have different parsers for the DOM process plugins that we have. That's still an idea that is in progress, but
Vaporware.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is something that I think it's a good idea that we can do. And another thing is to make the process plugins data extensible. So one thing that Drupal core Migrate API assumes is that every process plugins receive a string and outputs a string. And that's an assumption that it's reasonable, but I would like to maybe connect this with the typed API data that is used with the field API, for instance, to actually be more versatile. And maybe that's another way to get a general interface for what is expected between process plugins. And then we can extend that to have, by default, a string process plugin output. And then we can have like document object model output, and then maybe query parser object output. And that is, again, also still an idea. So that's probably something that we would like to do in the future. And also, I want to make a small note about HTML5. So if there is not yet a plugin for this, but it's pretty easy to do. Drupal core already has the Masterminds HTML5 library inside the Composer JSON, so you already have available that for use, and you can, in the same way that we have shown how to load HTML with the DOM extension, in the same way you can do that with Masterminds HTML class, and it will produce a DOM document. So it is similar. So you will just need to tweak the import inside the DOM plugin to actually do this. So that's probably also an extension that I would like to add to the base DOM plugin, so we can just import HTML5, because formally HTML5 is not XML, so it's something that we want to do with this library, for instance, that is already in core.
So, just a few things to wrap up. Here are references. I know you can't click on the screen, but if you look up the slides for this presentation, these are live links. The Migrate API documentation on Drupal.org is a good place to look at. The homepage for the Migrate Plus module, that's where we've contributed these plugins. The release notes for the most recent version, 5.0 RC1 of Migrate Plus, mentions these process plugins that we've added. I wrote a change record describing how to use these. Again, if you haven't seen it, that question and answer on Stack Overflow, I provide a link here. There's a blog post that refers to that as parsing HTML the Cthulhu way. And then the XPath documentation on the Mozilla Developer Network. We added a couple of slides last night, and I don't think all of those links made it here. So, for example, the recently added contrib module for media handling didn't make it to this slide. And that's it. Any further questions?
Yep.
So maybe this is getting off the rails, but so for example, if you wanted to find an image using that, it's going to be able to find the path, and you could replace the path. There isn't any additional formatting where you actually could find that image and then be able to migrate the actual physical image from somewhere locally or to somewhere outside.
So let me
That be not in the scope of this.
Let me summarize the question for the recording. So we know that this allows us a way to find all the image tags in our document. But the question is, can we then copy the actual image file as part of the migration?
Right.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, the use case of the new Migrate Media model that was the extra contributed model that we mentioned. So it's trying to do that. But what we have been using in the past is just to parse for all those URLs and do a simple file migration with those. And after that, you actually do the body processing and replacing with the new URLs.
But what he's talking about wouldn't necessarily work that way, because in unstructured text, you could have a link to a file that is not managed by Drupal. But what you could do is use the DOM processing to extract the URL to that file, and then pass that URL to a different plugin. I think it's like the copy plugin.
Yes.
There's definitely a core migration plugin that will file copy. Thank you. That will download a file and save it for you. So yeah, that's definitely something you could do. We don't do everything for you, but we give you the tools to do it.
Yeah.
Good question. Now, I think there were some others. Yeah.
So for some of this others, like static HTML sites you've migrated, like what percentage of the site you found like required manual, like you couldn't really parse it, too messy, and it required like manual copy and paste? Like what's the typical percentage of the site you're like, no, we're not gonna use an API? Or you have 100% coverage. You're like, okay, we can use a Migrate API to get all of this content from the static site into the target Drupal 8 site.
Static site. So the question is, when migrating a static site into Drupal 8, how much of it can be handled automatically by the migration, and how much do you have to go in and manually twiddle? Why do you specifically ask about a static site?
I have a lot of static sites to migrate. I have like 12 of them. And I'm not that familiar with the Migrate API. And I'm more familiar with other ways to parse. And I'm like, okay, am I going to put the effort to learn the Migrate API or use something I'm more familiar with to aggregate the data into CSVs and bulk import, since I don't have a lot of entity references? I'm trying to weigh my options on manual versus automated. What's the bigger lift? So I'm trying to just find a course. So I'm trying to figure out what others have faced in terms of manual migrations, and do they have full coverage with the Migrate API? Because I have no experience.
Okay, and the answer to my question is that he has a lot of static sites he has to migrate, and he's trying to decide whether the Migrate API is the appropriate tool to use. So I would say, if you find that you have to do some preliminary processing and create CSV files or XML or something else from your static sites, that the Migrate API would then be the appropriate tool to import from those CSV files into Drupal. Whether it can import directly from your directly from your static site, I'm not sure. It might not.
Yeah, you would need to write a new Migrate source plugin to actually, for instance, if you have your static file in one directory and you want to traverse that directory, you have tools in PHP to actually go over that files, like all the HTML files under this directory, and get each of them as a source for Drupal. So you need to write one source, Migrate source plugin that will go over each of them, and then you can parse with the DOM plugins to actually do the processing. For instance, if I want the H1, the first H1 to be the title of the node, and you can do that kind of processing with the DOM plugins. So it's totally possible.
And then the question he actually asked, what portion of it can be done automatically through the Migrate API, and how much manual fiddling do you have to do? That's not really the way we approach it. When we're developing a migration, we start out, we run a migration, we look at it, we do some QA, we find what's wrong. We fix that, and then we run the migration again, and it's an iterative process. And I don't think I've ever done a migration from a static site per se. We worked on the migration for Pega, which was featured in the Dries note at this year's DrupalCon. It was a large, complicated site, and we iterated several times. We fixed problems as they came up. I don't remember any specific manual fixing that had to be done after the migration.
Yeah, neither do I. And especially it's because of the numbers. At that time, we were migrating a lot of data. It was about
hundreds of thousands of users, tens of thousands of nodes.
Yeah.
Paragraph types, did they pose an issue parsing those and placing them in the new site? Like that, to me, not knowing a lot about it seems like that would add complexity, like getting the paragraphs, putting them on the new
So
site.
the question is, do paragraphs add complexity? Absolutely. I have a different talk where I talk about that. That is one of the three things, each of which will double the cost of your migration.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is totally possible. We have also created some process plugins to get data into paragraphs. But yeah, so it's definitely possible to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've been working with some migrations where I'll have just like a big WYSIWYG text that I'm converting into paragraphs. And something that I'm running into is that I'll have text, and then an image, and then more text. So I essentially have to break that into 3 separate paragraph entities. And I'm wondering if there's a more streamlined way to do that with process, because I'm having to go through the source and able to get multiple migration entities.
Yeah, so the question is that he's dealing with a migration where in the HTML text field, he has text and then image and text and then image, and he wants to break that up into several pieces and maybe create media entities from the images. And what are you using? Text paragraphs or from the text parts? Can that be handled by this sort of approach?
Yeah, I would say it is about like creating the right DOM plugins to do that, but you already have the structure. What I would do is like have several passes over the same source. So you have this source, and in the first pass you have a next path expression that captures this first part that will create this first paragraph entity, and then a second migration that will do the second part into the second part, in the second paragraph, and so on. And after that you have each of the paragraphs created, and then you create another migration with the node destination that will get all the reference of the last migrations, because you have a way to reference them already with the migration lookup plugin.
Yeah, and I've done something very similar to that. I think there's actually a contrib module that that handles that exact use case, but I didn't know about that when I was doing it. I wrote a blog post on it, so if you look on the Isovera blog, I've talked about that, and I did pretty much exactly what you described. And that was before we had these DOM plugins. So if I were doing it today, I would use the DOM plugins, but again, it's not something where we've done all the work for you, but it's something where we've provided some of the tools you can use.
Great, thank you.
We're a little low on time. I guess 5 minutes over is a little low on time. Any more quick questions, or shall we just hit the big red button again?
Big red button.
Okay.
Just before finishing the presentation, sorry about the button. I would like to say that it was a great project to be involved with, to create these DOM plugins, and it is something that we have. It took us a bit to actually interact with the Migrate Plus maintainer to get it inside, and we have improved a lot of the plugins in that process. The code that we were writing for those new plugins have been improved during the contribution to upstream. So if you are doing that, it is really useful for all the people involved. For us, was really useful because we were having some hints from the maintainer to actually what to change, and also for the general developers, because we will have a better tool at the end, a better source code. So if you are writing a DOM plugin, please try to reach out. Either Migrate Plus or create your own contributed module to actually do that, because it helps us all. Yeah, that's it. I just wanted to say that.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.